Let's keep it moving here with more of these election-related headlines. We know the economy, as it says in so many of these issue-based polls, it's the number one issue for so many American voters in the electorate here. Live picture there at the White House. We want to talk, though, about the housing market, specifically in some of these battleground states. I'm reading from a piece in the Washington Post just a couple of days ago. They report this: a multi-year surge in home prices has hit hardest in the swing states that are likely to determine the outcome of the presidential campaign, suggesting, they say, that America's housing affordability crisis is weighing heavily as the nation's most sought-after voters head to the polls. They report this: Americans in swing states are far more likely to live in areas where housing has become disproportionately more expensive since 2019. That's according to a Washington Post analysis of home price data. Now, they report nationally, home prices have grown 48% since 2019. That is not that long ago here. Let's talk about all of this and more with our friend, real estate analyst, expert, and attorney, Michael Romer. He joins me. Michael, thanks for being with us here. You've been following this very closely, but I got to ask, as we are, 11 days out from the election, we know that to get a mortgage, the mortgage rate, the fixed interest rate, that's down. Interest rates in general are down since the Fed made that 50-point basis cut last month. And inflation is coming down as well. Now, shouldn't that be a good recipe, a good cocktail for would-be home buyers when they're looking to buy a home, that prices are eventually going to come down, or not?
Well, it certainly sounds good, and thank you, Andrew, for having me back. But the real problem is none of that solves the underlying root of the problem, and that is the lack of housing in this country. We have a lack of housing, so to start with, it's a supply and demand issue. There's simply not enough housing, which keeps the price up. And then you mix in inflation over the last 4 or 5 years, that also keeps the prices up, and it puts potential home buyers in a really delicate situation where the cost to buy a home over the last 5 years has effectively doubled. And that's really hitting the pockets and hitting the wallets of people all across this country, in particular, these swing states, right? These often discussed swing states, which often decide elections. Right now, one of the biggest issues that are impacting swing state voters is the cost of housing. And it's a real problem. There was a recent study by Redfin, and it said that 91% of Gen Zers in swing states, this is one of the top issues that they're facing, and it will seriously impact their vote. So this is really where we are. It's a national crisis, and it's something that has to be looked at, and we need a real action plan as to how to solve it.
So I want to talk about some of the candidates' plans in just a moment here, but reading more from the piece in the Washington Post, because here at Live Now, one of our locations, we're in the battleground state of Arizona, in Phoenix. They say this: housing costs emerge as the starkest economic challenge, especially in Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina. They report in those 3 states, more than 80% of voters live in counties where housing costs surged faster than the national average. That was between August of 2019 and August of this year. So, Michael, it's not just New York City. It's not just Chicago. It's not D.C. It's not Los Angeles. It's in these battleground states, places like Phoenix, places like Raleigh, Charlotte, Durham, places like Atlanta.
I'll give you a number. Wilmington, North Carolina, recent report, prices have gone up 62%. Right? These are the swing states. These are the areas in the suburbs across the country where people are looking to move and they're looking to buy, and it's very, very expensive. It's very difficult for a family to buy a home if prices have gone up so dramatically over the last 5 years. So just in that one town alone, 62%. In multiple counties all across the 7 swing states, we're looking at numbers on average of 48%. You're referencing the Washington Post research study that was done. Redfin did one of its own, and we're looking at more than half. So we're a 50% increase. So this is really impacting the wallets, and it's going to be an issue that will be weighing on people's minds when they go into the voting booth, because this is at the core of of our economy, right? People need a place to live. And the real issue is there just isn't enough housing. And then you mix in high interest rates, which are coming down a little. But if you've been following, mortgage rates have gone up a little bit because there's this perception that when the Fed drops interest rates, that it's ultimately going to drop the mortgage rates on residential mortgages.
I
But
see.
that's not the case. Residential mortgages are tied to a number of factors, most particularly the 10-year Treasury bond, which is it's based on a whole different set of factors. So right now, we're anticipating going into next year lower interest rates. I mean, we could use maybe another half a point on the residential side to
Okay.
really get things going. But what we really, really need are incentives for builders to build, because that's what the holdup is.
I see.
Inflation has driven up the cost of construction. It's driven up the cost of housing, and it's basically taken away the incentive of builders to build.
So that is what your solution. You said the main problem with the housing market is a dearth of supply. So let's talk about the Harris and Trump campaign platforms, how they intend to lower costs for housing for would-be home buyers, and maybe by increasing supply here. I mean, we've heard Harris. We show our viewers her remarks, Trump's remarks each and every day. Harris talks specifically about housing and what she would do, more so than Trump. That's just an observation. Trump talks about housing, but he doesn't get into the granular details like Harris. Now, whether or not you agree with what Harris wants to do with it, that's another question here. But I'm just noting the differences between the two campaigns and candidates. What have you noticed about their housing planks and their platforms, Michael?
You know, it's been interesting to see. You would think that a former real estate developer would talk about real estate more in campaign speeches. However, he has recently been talking more and more about it. There's different plans on the table. What the Trump plan typically references the most is deregulation, making it easier for developers to build, freeing up more land. There's a lot of reference to the vast swaths of land that the federal government controls that they could potentially free up for housing construction. Now, that there's a lot of factors at play here, environmental and otherwise, but that's really the core of the Trump plan, as I understand it, is to free up more land and incentivize builders to build. Now, on the other side, the proposed Harris plan, you're looking at a drive to potentially add 3 million more housing units, more lower housing income tax credits, things of that nature. So it's really two different paths. The other piece of the Harris plan is this concept of $25,000
Right.
that would go to potential homeowners. Then some would argue, well, okay, well, if you're giving a home buyer, potential home buyer, $25,000, well, ultimately the seller could say, okay, well, I'm going to increase the price by $25,000 because I'd rather those funds come to me. So
Okay.
it makes sense to incentivize buyers to buy, but there needs to be an incentive for the sellers to sell.
I see.
And that's the threading of the needle that both sides are trying to do.
So you talk about incentives for home sellers and home buyers here. But the Harris campaign plank, the incentive comes from a government subsidy. Let's just call it that here. Is there a role for the government to intervene proactively to do something about the housing supply crisis and the housing cost crisis? Or is it your view that they should step out of it completely? I mean, is there a role for the government here to address this or not? At least Harris thinks so, right?
Well, there's a different ideology at play here,
Sure.
right? In terms of what should the role of the government be on any issue, whether it's housing or anything else. Now, some would argue that the federal government should have a very limited role and let the private sector take care of this. Some would argue, well, okay, things have really reached the point where the government needs to step in, and that's really that'll be decided in the election booth, because when you're looking at this, it's a tricky problem, but history will tell you that the federal government has limited ability to solve a housing crisis, right? There's certain tax benefits that could be imposed. You could have federal lower housing tax credits, things of that nature, potentially some income tax benefits, things like that, which would require acts of Congress. And really, both parties need to come together whenever this election is resolved and put together a plan that really works and would really benefit the citizens of this country. Because what we're dealing with is a true problem where housing is just way too expensive, and not just the cost of housing, the monthly housing payments. In many swing states over the last 5 years, the monthly housing payments have increased, wait for this number, 92% over the last 5 years. So when you're looking at this, these are staggering numbers, and when it's very difficult. And one thing that's getting talked a lot about is people are now starting to worry about whether or not their children will be able to afford a home. So something needs to give. One thing for starters, in my humble opinion, is single family homes need to be owned by families, right? Or individuals. They should not be owned by institutional investors.
Oh, wow.
That's my
Okay.
that's my personal opinion.
We're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing a lot of that. I mean, does that kind of send a chill down your spine, a la the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008? I mean, do you feel that? And I wanted to ask too, because is there a bottom? Is there a floor? Does this bubble, if you want to call it that, burst in your view here? What's the trajectory?
Well, you're looking at a situation now where institutional investors, own more than half of the single family homes in this country, right? And some of these homes are being rented out, obviously, and which is keeping, now there's a demand for that, but they're only doing it because they're profiting off this, right? So rent has to be at a certain level, and that rent typically is not affordable to the average home buyer or home renter. So what we really need to do is look at the entire landscape across the country and try and keep the focus on single family homes being for individuals, families, whatever the situation may be, as opposed to institutional investors. A lot of the institutions, a lot of the investment folks got heavily involved in single family homes because it can be very profitable, but it just added to the supply problem.
Right. Michael Romer, as always, really great stuff, really great information. And we'll see, especially in some of these battleground states, whether housing drives people out to the polls. Michael, thanks so much. Have a good weekend.
Thanks for having me.
All right. In the meantime here, I hope you found that conversation informative. Of course, we'll be talking about issues like that in the next 11 days. Those are the issues that you tell us matter so much to you. Speaking of some of these battleground states, we have some gorgeous Live Now looks in some of these cities like Atlanta there. Georgia was one of these battleground states. Also Arizona. Gorgeous Live Now look over the Valley of the Sun there in the Phoenix area. And this one, I believe, is in North Carolina, in Wilmington on the coast there, on the Atlantic coast there in the Tar Heel State in Wilmington. We'll be back in just a moment.